Well, hey there. Thanks for watching this video. Here we're going to talk about open market operations. If you recall back from our discussion regarding monetary policy, we discussed the different ways that the government, specifically the Federal Reserve, tries to improve the health of the economy. So in this case, we're talking about the U.S. economy. Now, open market operations are one of the tools that the Fed has in their disposal to try and improve the health of the economy. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk specifically about that, how that really works, and go into an example of really what that looks like from a practical standpoint. So open market operations, you're probably familiar with some of the basics. You probably read or seen some of the news related to the U.S. buying different securities, related to the ECB purchasing securities. That really is kind of what open market operations are in a nutshell. What the government is doing is they're buying and selling securities. And so these are things like, for example, U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. Treasury notes, and mortgage-backed securities specifically, which was the most recent thing purchased by the Federal Reserve as a part of QE3 that ended several years ago. So how does that really work? How does buying government securities or treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities, how does that really make a difference? So to start, we've got to learn about who the kind of players are involved in this process. So the first player, of course, is the U.S. government. And the U.S. government is going to be an active participant in this process. By U.S. government, in this example, we're talking specifically about the Fed. Now, the other player involved are the banks. And as we recall, the banks are the distribution mechanism for getting liquidity into the hands of consumers and businesses. So the government doesn't print or create money in a sense. It does that utilizing the banks. So here's how the process works as an example. So the U.S. government, if they see a need to kind of let's say, provide some initial momentum for the economy, right? Trying to jumpstart it, kind of like you would jumpstart a battery on a car. What it can do is try to inject cash into the economy so that people can in turn take those monies in the form of loans and then purchase whether it's durable goods or any other thing for that matter. And then that in turn re-injects the money back into the economy. And hopefully this cyclical kind of event takes place like we talked about previously. So in this case, the U.S. government, remember, under monetary policy, we're not redistributing money, we're creating money. So the Federal Reserve is going to facilitate a transfer to the banks. And it is going to send over some type of capital. So it literally goes into into a program and transfers, for example, let's say $40 billion onto the bank's balance sheets. And so now that money is on the bank's balance sheets. Now, the important thing is that money didn't ordinarily or previously exist. So by creating it and creating the transfer rather, that money is now in circulation. Now, in return, the Federal Reserve, or the banks more specifically, are going to provide back to the Fed some type of security. And so that can take the form of either a U.S. Treasury security, mortgage-backed security, or something of that nature. And so it's essentially an IOU. It's a promise to get paid in a certain later point. Currently, the Fed has roughly about $4 trillion in securities, ranging from, again, mortgage-backed securities to U.S. Treasury bonds and those types of things. And so it's a very big holder of U.S. debt. And so that's kind of how the initial process takes place. Again, the Fed facilitates this transfer to the banks. That, of course, in return, they get some kind of asset in the form of security, and then they hold on to those particular monies. Now, the banks then, of course, are going to go ahead and they're going to make loans. And so that's going to filter down to different businesses and consumers. And then they're in turn going to go ahead and spend that money, whether it's businesses on hiring or purchase equipment, or it's consumers on purchasing just basic necessities and those types of things. And then that money is essentially going to go back to businesses, and then it's going to circle back to employees if we hire and have growth and those sorts of things. Now, the other interesting thing about this process is what it does to the supply of money. So if you're thinking about the supply of money, you're thinking about the money that is in circulation. And so for starters, let's say we've got some money here that's in circulation. And then we're going to expand that. And so the amount of money that is available for consumers has essentially increased. And so this is going to do a couple of interesting things pertaining to interest rates and those types of things. Now, we talked about interest rates being a very kind of significant lever that the government can pull to try and influence the economy. Well, purchasing securities in the open market is one of the things that influences the interest rates that we pay for things on homes or vehicles and those types of things. And the way that works is if you think about it from a supply and demand standpoint, the Federal Reserve is essentially creating what we call artificial demand. And so what that means is that there is demand for those types of securities. But if the Federal Reserve is going to purchase $40 billion in a given month, that is a huge amount of demand for those particular securities. So what happens now is that there is less of those securities to go around. There's more demand for them. We know that based on the kind of basic tenets of supply and demand, when a price of a good or the availability of a good diminishes, of course, this price tends to increase. And so what happens now is we create an increase in prices. So prices for securities begin to go up. And then what happens as a result of this is the yields on those securities, so essentially the interest that is paid on the securities begins to go down. And the reason for that is bond prices move inversely to yields, which means as one goes up, the other one goes down. Now you're probably asking, why is that the case? Well, think about it from a standpoint of trying to provide an incentive for someone to purchase it. If a security is deemed to be in demand, so the price of it rises, do you really need to provide as much of an incentive in terms of an interest rate for someone to acquire it if the perception is it's in demand? So as a result, that causes those yields to decrease. Now, the interesting thing is that for like a 10-year or 30-year bond, the interest rates on homes are directly tied to those interest rates. And those are a large influence on what we can get for mortgage rates. And so that's how the Federal Reserve can both expand the money supply, which means you're allowing consumers and businesses access to more capital to spend, but then at the same point in time, you're also putting downward pressures on interest rates, which in turn make vehicle loans and make home loans more affordable to again facilitate more spending. Now, the concern of all this, and I'm sure you're figuring this out, is, well, what happens when an increased amount of money is now competing for a small number or the same number of goods and services? And so that as a result, inflation is a potential byproduct of this process. Now, the Fed, of course, monitors inflation on a regular basis. At the time of this recording, inflation is nowhere near the Federal Reserve's target, which is 2%. So that is the gauge that we use to evaluate if the economy is growing too much. And then, of course, we need to remove some of these accommodative monetary policy measures, much like open market operations that we've described in this video, of course.